Hi everybody, today my partner Camila Hernandez and I are going to talk about politically correct language of disability and disabilities in newspaper and magazines, so in writing texts. So first, for this project it was decided to investigate the use of some euphemisms or politically correct terms to refer to people with disabilities through writing language as newspapers and magazines, as I expressed before. So our motivation is that the language is changing day by day, and for that reason is to provide to the society the opportunity to express social norms, to express perception, and for that reason we take into account that the language tend to include or must include through the days people and social groups that are discriminated or have some disabilities, as people that are, for example, blind, people that are deaf. So the words of interest that we selected to this project was taken from the Disability Language Style Guide. It is an article developed by the National Center on Disability and Journalism at Arizona State University. So the main purpose of this guide is to lead to journalists and communicators to figure it out how to refer to these people, this group people that I already mentioned, that the people that are discriminated from others that don't tend to use that politically correct terms. To carry out this project, we selected 2 research questions to complete and to find the results that we want. So the first research question is politically correct language used in magazines and newspaper subcorpora when talking about disabilities? And the second research question is, with what actions are these terms more commonly associated? In our findings, we find an article that is related with our project. So we find an article called Politically Correct Euphemism in Mass Media, based on American and Turkish online periodicals of the beginning of the 21st century. So in this featured article, politically correct terms were analyzed in American and Turkish online magazines. So this article gives us a base to explore more about the American magazines and newspapers. To explain more about the project, we selected the Corpus, the Corpus of Contemporary American English, and as we already mentioned, we choose 2 subcorpora, that is newspaper and magazine.
So, to start with this project, we start with the frequency lists. So, we choose first 2 terms, deaf as an adjective and hard of hearing. So it is like the euphemism of deaf. So first we find deaf in a frequency of 82 terms in the corpus, in both third corpora, magazine and newspaper, and we found that this term was more frequent in 1995 to 1999 and between 2005 and 2009. The next finding was dyslexia versus dyslexic. So for the first word, we found that it has a frequency of 147, and it was most frequent in the period 1995 to 1999. And the other term, that is dyslexic, it was most frequent with 89 terms in both third corpora that we already mentioned in the period of 2002 to 2004. The next terms that we find and we search it was mentally disabled versus mentally retarded. So for the first term, the frequency was of 139, and it was more frequent in the period of 2005 to 2009. And for the second term, that it is mentally retarded, we can find that the frequency is of 257, and it was more frequent in 1990 to 1994. And finally, the next terms are blind as an adjective and versus visually impaired. Visually impaired was the political correct term to refer to blind people or people with this condition of low vision. So the frequency of the first term, that is blind, has a frequency of 5,305, and it was more frequent in the period of 2005 to 2009. And the frequency of visually impaired was of 163, and the period that was more frequent was in two periods, 2005 to 2009 and to 2015 to 2009.
Okay, so our second strategy was to look at the verb collocates, three spaces to the right and three spaces to the left of the note. We took each term and we analyzed the then more frequent collocates. So our first term is deaf as adjective, and we classify these collocates within two categories. So the first category is origin, and it refers to the place, moment, or situation where the disability came from. So here we have some verbs such as turn, born, become, and go. So for example, with go, everybody's going deaf. The other category, that is not a category per se, is some expressions that we found. These expressions are relevant because, for example, one of them is fall on deaf ears, and these have one of the most frequent collocates of the word deaf, that is fell, and the different conjugations fell, fallen, fallen. So that's why we are mentioning the expression, because it is frequent. But let's see some examples. So we have, I'm guessing that advice may fall on deaf ears since for many customers it's an impulse buy. Now let's move to the next term. The next term that we analyze is hard of hearing. This term is different from the previous one, and with this term we didn't find collocations that give us extra information or relevant information, because first, the collocations don't seem to be connected with any category related to talking about disabilities, and also the most common collocation that is showed has nothing to do with talking about disabilities either. So if you look at the example that we have on the screen, it says, to the hard of hearing you should, and for the almost blind you draw starting figures. So this is the most common collocate, and this is a part of a poem, yeah, and that's the most frequent collocate. So here we didn't find something relevant for our investigation. Now let's continue. The next term is dyslexia, and here we have some interesting findings. So first, we have some verbs that are related to victimhood, and these are overcome, suffer, and afflicted. This is super important because this is something that was also mentioned in the guide we used as a base for this investigation, and is that they, as a general suggestion, they say that people need to avoid phrases that suggest discomfort, constant pain, and a sense of hopelessness. Like in general, they tell us to avoid terms that suggest victimhood. Yeah, and they even give us some examples that are afflicted by victim of suffers from. Yeah, and as you can see, these are actually collocates of the term dyslexia. Yeah, so this was an interesting finding. Okay, we have a new category, yeah, that is called any other disease. And what we want to say with this category is that this disability is just as any other health problem. That's the thing. So here we have some verbs that are commonly used to talk about diseases in general. So we have detected, diagnosed, noun, struggle. Finally, we have another category that is synonym. So in this category, we have the words that are used in the same way, in the same level. So for example, for this term, we found the synonym learning disabilities. So let's see the example. That he has explored a self-loathing that stems in part from dyslexia and learning disabilities. Our next term is dyslexic, and with this term we have the same situation as with hard of hearing. The collocations don't seem to be connected with any category, nor do they provide any relevant info for the research we are doing. The only relevant word was diagnosed that can be classified in any other disease. Yeah, that's the category in which it can be classified. So let's move to the next category. The next category is mentally disabled. So in this term, we found two main categories. The first one is origin with the verb born, and the second one is this category that we already mentioned, that is victimhood. And here we have verbs such as help, care for, abusing, and wounded. So let's see the examples. Is the more compassionate way that we as a nation care for the mentally disabled. Another example, he says of his job helping to care for mentally disabled children. Next term is mentally retarded, and here we have some new categories. So the first new category what we have is verbs that express that people with disabilities are required to belong to or be identified as something, yeah, to be part of a group. So here we have verbs such as label, classify, and categorize. Yeah, so for example, black students are 3 times more likely than all other racial and ethnic groups combined to be labeled mentally retarded. Now we have another new category that is disability as a crime. So I think this category is pretty clear. I think we all know what it refers to. And the two terms that we have here are execute and exempted. Again, we have some verbs related to origin, that is born, diagnosed, and considered. And finally, we have again the category synonym, and here we have emotionally disturbed as a collocate for mentally retarded.
The next term is blind as an adjective, and we find some category of these collocations. So the first was origin, and we find some collocates that was born, turn, in different tenses as turn, turning, and turns, and flying. And the other category is victimhood that we already mentioned, and the collocates was arranged, impaired, rendered, and sampled. So an example could be local audio information for blind and visually impaired people in Nebraska and Southwest Iowa. And the last term is visually impaired. So we categorize the collocates in that way. The first category is victimhood, with the terms help, assisting, learn, facilitate, receives, lends, and amplified. The second category is required to belong to or be identified as something, with the collocates actioneer and classified. And the third category is disability as a crime, with the verb roam. So an example could be: then there are apps like Cedalon meant to help the visually impaired get around more easily. So it is an example for the collocate help of the term visually impaired.
The results show that the euphemisms blind, dyslexia, and deaf are used more frequently than the other terms we look at. Yeah. However, the study is not extensive enough to provide a decisive judgment about the use of the terms suggested by the guide. What do we want to say with this? What we want to say is that the fact that these euphemisms are more frequently used than the other terms doesn't mean that this applies to all the concepts or all the terms that are included in the guide. That's why a more extensive analysis is required. Now, regarding the discussion question 2, we have that disability is portrayed as a crime. People with disabilities are depicted as victims. And in general, it can be said that in the newspaper and magazine discourse, individuals with disabilities are represented with politically correct language. That's a fact. However, there are some terms that have a negative semantic prosody. And why is this important? This is important because people with disabilities simply living their lives don't exist to inspire others. That means they are not victims, they don't want to be perceived as victims. Or at least that's what the guide is telling us and what other different guides are trying to share with people. Yeah. Another thing is that, and is related to this idea of victimhood, is that people with disabilities are not always suffering. They don't want to be a model, nor do they want to be an inspiration for us. Yeah, they just want to be one person more, and that's why depicting these people as victims is not a good idea. Yeah. Now, like in general terms regarding the two research questions, there is an article called "The Dynamics of Euphemization in Legal Language," in which it is expressed that in 1888, a law stipulated changing terms related to disability to politically correct language. Why is this important? This is important because this is helping to narrow the implications of our findings. So, this is telling us that the point is not only about the terms we use, it's not only about the regulations we have. This is about the way people in general perceive disabilities and how this perception connects with a whole system of meaning. That means that it is not enough to create guides or to create rules, but to make people understand that feeling different is not always cool, that they cannot just continue calling people this way if they do want to be called in that way. And yeah, that's basically the discussion. And as a conclusion, the main conclusions resulting from this is that first, a wider research needs to be carried out, and a wider research includes more terms and more subcorpora. And also, and this is part of our reflection for people that would like to replicate this study or to make something better, and is that some terms can have uses that are not directly related to disabilities. That's something we saw today. Yeah, so the selection of the terms and the analysis of the collocations is key to identify if what the frequency lists are telling us is true and is reliable and is in fact connected to what we want to study. So thank you so much for hearing us. That's all.